I'm Cole Haddon, and welcome back to 5 a.m. Story Talk. Today's guest is an author, a design advocate, and a cyborg anthropologist. Yes, I said cyborg anthropologist. I'm talking about the fascinating Amber Case here, and we're about to discuss what's gone wrong with how we interact with our technology and how to fix it.
It's not about ethics. It's about making something that is in line with what technology promised us, which was to give us more human time back. And I think most of us spend more time configuring our technology than we do using it.
Welcome back, Story Talkers. Today I'm joined by someone who, well, she blew my mind listening to her. I wasn't entirely sure what to expect from our conversation, which I never do when I have on non-artists. I think that's what makes them such exciting guests. But this week, you get to listen to me chat with someone who helped me articulate just so much about what's gone wrong with design, our relationship to technology in terms of utility and aesthetic, and how this has even impacted the art we have access to. There were points while editing this that I gasped a little at observations she made. Anyway, enough beating around the proverbial bush here. My guest this week is Amber Case. She's an internationally recognized design advocate and a cyborg anthropologist, which is a really cool way of saying she studies how humans and technology evolve together. I'll drop a link to her great TED Talk, We Are All Cyborgs Now, in the show notes. Amber is also the founder of the Calm Tech Institute, which exists to establish new standards for designing more harmonious human-technology interactions that improve not just how we use the tech, but also how we enjoy it. We're going to talk a lot about craft and beauty and how these things have vanished from a lot of what we use in our everyday lives, to our cultural and even psychological detriment. When you're done listening to this conversation with Amber, I encourage you to check out the Calm Tech link in the show notes to see some of the products it endorses to understand how differently tech could exist in your life. Rather than what, say, Apple demands you accept as the pinnacle of design and utility, which is kind of a bad joke at this point. A quick heads up before we dive into this conversation about how things could be and should be in our homes and lives and the world around us. When this episode wraps up, you're going to want to stick around. That's because I'm going to tell you how to listen to my bonus ep with Amber. She returns to discuss a foundational piece of art from her life, 2001, A Space Odyssey. God, I love this film. This bonus ep is an amazing extension of everything we'll discuss in this feature ep. If you enjoyed this episode from 5 a.m. Story Talk, be sure to subscribe so this podcast keeps showing up in your life. Okay, are you ready to dive into today's episode? Let me introduce you to author, design advocate, and cyborg anthropologist, Amber Case. Welcome, Amber. It's great to have you here. How's your apocalypse going this week?
Yeah, just considering how many generations we get if we're on linear time versus circular time. And yours?
Better than most, but we'll see. It's just the start of it, so could go downhill very quickly. That's the 21st century for you. So I'll just jump in. The first question's a little bit longer, but while studying at university, I first became aware of the human enhancement movement that began in the aftermath of World War I and the response to tens of thousands of veterans who had suffered the loss of limbs. Homo prostheticus was one term to describe this new Superman, and it terrified me, and the idea of cybernetic enhancement continues to do so. But I know that's an unfair bias because, as you would no doubt be quick to point out, we're already cyborgs. So to start, I wanted to ask you why it is that the term cyborg makes so many of us uncomfortable, even as we line up to buy the latest tech products that our lives now depend on.
Sure. I've run a little conference called Cyborg Camp on the future of humans and technology, and we had a really wonderful speaker named Hideshi Hamaguchi back in 2008, and he talked about the norm level of technology, where everything was basically we didn't even notice it anymore. And anything below that would get us to the norm was restorative. So you can't see, here's some eyeglasses, now you're at the norm. Now you look through those eyeglasses as a pass-through technology, and they can even be decorative, they dissolve. But anything above that isn't the norm in society, like bionic glasses that allow you to see through walls, because not everybody has it, that's enhancing, and that's where everybody gets weirded out, because in a military industrial complex, of course there's going to be a killing machine that's outfitted with stuff that you can't access as a civilian, so eek. But a medical prosthetic, like a cane, a leg, a pacemaker, all these things, because they're installed in a medical environment to get you to the norm level that is the current thing, then it's not really a big deal. And so that's the definition point that he drew out for us at that conference, which, how can you tell if something is scary or not? Does everybody else have it? Are you catching up? If you are catching up, or it hasn't been really dissolved into to the fabric of human awareness yet, then it's scary. So when the elevator came out, people were afraid to press the buttons themselves. And it wasn't until the elevator operators went on strike that people learned they could press the buttons. So it's not that tech isn't ready for us, it's that humans aren't ready for tech. And a lot of the tech that's being built isn't made really well, and the focus is usually on the tech. It looks nice in a movie, I want that at home. Then you take it home, it's a bad roommate, or it's doing something that you don't like and you can't do anything about it, or the company goes out of business and it's not supporting you. And so these are all of these situations that Sigmund Freud wrote a book called Civilization and Its Discontents, in which he warned of a possible future in which our ill-fitting prosthetics would turn against us, and that we would be marred by an over-proximity of all things, which I think we are in the exact world that he predicted. There's a great book about this called The Prosthetic Impulse, the idea that humans really want to make tools outside of themselves, and we've made more tools than any other creature. Not to say that all of them are good. Not all of us are excellent tool makers. A lot of us are making tools really quickly. We don't have design principles in mind. But if you're looking at different species who are building caves, like groundhogs and all these different animals, and you analyze their structures, they're fantastic architects, and they have basically HVAC systems and ventilation, all these things. So across all animal species, we have all sorts of different things that we've specialized at. And just looking at early Persia, there was air conditioning, indoor air conditioning with underground rivers. There was basically shaved ice in the desert, I think 2,000 years ago. So if we put our mind to something, we're very, very clever. And when I say we're all cyborgs, the term actually comes from a paper on space travel. And the definition is any organism, any human creature, anything, to which external components have been attached to allow them to adapt to new ambient spaces. So someone going into space with a spacesuit, an environment they shouldn't be in, is being a cyborg. But you're also a cyborg when you put on a pair of flippers and scuba diving gear. It's these external adaptations that you can then take off and put somewhere else. When we look at permanent adaptations, let's say a pacemaker or something like that, then we might be a little more cyborg. So it's this whole spectrum of, learning to love the cyborg. It really is, who's made the equipment? Does it have control over you? Do you have ownership over your privacy and your data? There's this book, and one of the passages in it by Harlan Ellison says, "I have no mouth, but I must scream." And it's all about the idea, I think of it in customer service. You've used some piece of technology, it's not very good, you're stranded in the woods because the battery on your car fob went out and there's no backup key, and there's no one to talk to. And there's an automated bot that's trying to say, "Oh, I'm sorry, you're experiencing something difficult. We'll put you in the support queue and get back to you in 3 days." Meanwhile, you die in the forest, right? So in traditional engineering, every engineering student is supposed to see this video of a catastrophic bridge failure from 1940 called Galloping Gertie in Washington State. And that's all about a bridge where it was specified to be pretty strong when wind went through it, but it was built not very well, and it had a catastrophic failure. And it's a visual that shows you, as an engineer, as a civil engineer, you have a responsibility to people to say, if there's too much wind, know the limits of that bridge and close it. To specify it so well that even if a contractor and a subcontractor don't build it well, you still survive. You can go across it within temperature ranges and wind ranges, and it's all about this like engineering code of ethics. And the problem with that is that when we design software, no one ever shows us a video in Intro to Software class about what happens when you design something poorly, when you don't consider failure, when you don't involve redundancy. The imagination is based more on shiny stuff than it is based on how something really works over time. There's almost an allergy to caring about anything that could be sustainable for 10 years. No, it has to be the new thing. We don't care about maintenance. We care about whether it's fresh. And this is a big issue. One of my friends calls it subterranean entropy. With entropy, you're in a house, things tend to get in disarray, you leave cups and mugs everywhere, the kitchen sink is the biggest source of entropy. But subterranean entropy is like the entropy that builds up over time that you can't see. Like someone forgetting to floss their teeth, and then 3 years later, it builds up. And what I think of is when we don't design systems well or care about how they work, this subterranean entropy builds up and we have bigger catastrophic failures. And the other analogy I think of is Chesterton's fence. There's two people in a field looking at this fence. Why is this fence here? We don't know why it's here. Let's just take it down. Of course, there's a giant steer that's coming at them and it's going to gore them. And I think that's the thing is when new people come to a system that looks analog, archaic, old, like microfiche, for instance, which are little tiny shrunken pictures that you can read by a machine with a big light behind it. So you can take all the office records and put them into a tiny little box and have it last for 40 years. Somebody might look at that and say, oh, we can automate that. But they don't look at the costs of the server that it takes to serve those files on. They don't say, well, we can automate it and make sure it goes really well for 2 or 3 years. But it's not going to give us 40 years. And so I think our time horizons are shrinking and shrinking and shrinking. And even our design is almost a mix of like nostalgia for a history that never existed. Like our future is outdated. Like the future is outdated. It's based on a 1950s notion of flying cars and Jetsons and sleek interfaces. And I feel like that was all about running away from World War II. How many things got destroyed that were beautiful? Well, let's build in a way where maybe it's not so beautiful again, so if it gets destroyed, we can just remake it. Let's not have this beautiful, handmade, crafted, wooden, wainscoting, beautiful, harmonious buildings because they could just get destroyed anyway. Let's build this new sleek, perfect skyscraper, mirrored glass. And then maybe we'll feel better because we don't have any history. And that way we can't get hurt.
It's fascinating. Where do you think the breakdown in design started in terms of creating, I guess, a disposable culture? My wife and I talk about this all the time. Why did my grandmother and grandfather have the same fridge for 30 years and she was still using the same iron when she died that she bought when my father was born? And yet today we talk about iPhones 2.5 years as if it's time to trade it in. And it's disposable, but also it seems like aesthetic has trumped utility.
Yeah, I think there's so many factors. I think, the first one is that you can have a very strong German middle-class manufacturing sector because you have small family-run businesses that build up in knowledge over time, multi-generational, that take that, it's like a barrel maker. Your last name would be Cooper because you make barrels. Great. How many generations did you make barrels? Oh, at least 7. And when you were 5, were you hanging out with your parents while they made barrels? Yeah. So on average, if you were to compete with someone who started making barrels because they were hipster and they wanted to do something artisanal because they saw it in some magazine, do you think you would be able to outperform that person? Yes, of course. As a 10-year-old? Absolutely. All right? So the level of quality that multi-generational small family businesses could produce without even thinking completely outperforms most things that we have today. And it was also priced in a way that you might buy one, yeah, and you keep it for 30 years, but because it was a company that had the same components, you had a local business that could sell you the components and you could learn how to maintain it yourself. And I did go recently to one of those places. They had, since the 70s, the same everything, lovingly maintained at like really high altitude in Colorado, and cooked on all those surfaces and used the washer and dryer, and it was exactly from the 70s. And the user interface of these systems was so beautifully done. It was initially a little bit confusing, and once you got it, it was exactly where it should be. All of the dials were actually above the stove, so it was really, really easy to clean the interface without worrying about scratching off any of the knobs and controls. Everything was ergonomically shaped, so you just felt like you were flying through this kitchen. I don't know, it was this beautiful thing, and it was so it's first, I think it's those small family businesses that don't need to expand every quarter. They're not doing quarterly reports. They're doing make sure the family survives, have some money in the pot, so if there's a recession or there's a downturn, you can exist and stay true, I think, to family values and have a legacy. And there's a book called The Millionaire Next Door, which is all about, local plumbing companies. And, they try to find all these millionaires, and they invited to one place. They put caviar because they were thinking they would interview them. And it's a bunch of plumbers and electricians and like local franchise owners of like a Chili's. And it was surprising because it was based on family and it was based on quality of life. And they were scrappy and they had deep knowledge. So how we are taught in schools is also another aspect. We are not having shop class anymore, so we don't know how to use tools and fix stuff and make things with our hands. We don't have home economics, so we're not learning how to sew. It doesn't matter what gender you are, it's useful life skills. And we don't even have, there's auto mechanic class. There's so many different things. Yeah. And even now I was interviewing someone who's a kindergarten teacher, and she said in kindergarten, per semester, there was only one collective art project for the kids, and they already have Chromebooks. So their eyes are just getting lacerated by high-energy OLED displays, and they're learning how to use Google Docs. And you might say, oh, that's cool. They're with the future. But they aren't learning how to handwrite anymore. And how the mind reacts to handwriting, it's been shown, is completely different to a flat, very untactile clickety-clack of even a Mac keyboard, or the complete touchlessness of smooth glass. So when you're writing notes on paper, you'll remember so much more of them, but you only have to take a quarter or a fifth the notes, because every time you're shaping those letters, it's a different part of your mind that's getting stimulated, and that's really good for you. So I see, one is people are doing publicly traded companies and construction consolidation and automation. So you can make a thing at scale and deliver it to the world, but you don't have that history of that craft. 2, we don't have local people that are going to fix your TV. 3, a publicly traded company has to keep growing, so they have to find more surface area to grow. And 4, we aren't learning how to maintain the things that we have in our own place, and so it becomes this arduous issue. So I think all of that's going on, that our time horizons have shortened, and now we have the over proximity of all things, but we don't treasure or care for most of these objects at all. I was looking at some old photos, and I didn't even remember phone cases that I had in the past. Oh, I used to have that phone case? Huh. Because I didn't treasure that object. I'm just looking, like, in most people's rooms, I went to my grandparents' house, after all the family members died, and I just wanted to get things from their house, anything. And, people were looking at me like, these aren't very valuable. And I said, they're valuable because they've been used for 70 years, and I'm going to continue to use this ruler and, this lithograph swiper for screen printing. It was special. I have this nice, beautiful lamp that they used. It's got a halogen bulb, so you need to put a UV filter on it. So I had to learn all about that. When I turn it on, the light is a beautiful, they call it CRI, color rendering index. You can see, it feels like daylight, it feels like beautiful colors. You don't get that from the meagerness of an LED. So I think fundamentally, the surface area, the depth, the texture of life, and our ability to engage at more than one glass-based surface level, like the whole world is turned into an iPad, is causing a lot of anxiety and depression because there's some joy in that detail. Our brain expects a heavy amount of detail and actually calms us down. And so I think there's a lot that's gone.
When my grandmother died, and that was after my grandfather had already died, but he was a carpenter and he made her a rolling pin. And it was the one thing I laid claim to in the house, just that it was beautiful. And it broke my heart that all the other beautiful pieces that my grandfather had made were essentially disregarded by the family. I think they probably made it to the curb. And it was such a loss to me. When I listen to you talk, and I've also listened to other lectures you've given, I hear somebody who understands the value of tactile experiences, but also artisanal experiences. Switching gears for a moment to your story, is this part of your family's ancestry? Did you come from artisans, people who made beautiful things like these?
No. I mean, if you look at it on both sides, it's definitely farmers, right? But when you are a farmer, an early one before the age of automation, you do make all your own tools. You do build your own house. I was just before this talking with my mom's cousin who lives self-sufficiently on a ranch that he bought a long time ago and outside of, in just rural Utah. The next nearest town is 56 people. And he has to figure out the nonverbal language of all the animals. He's got a huge herd of cattle. And he's not wealthy by any means, but the level of detail that he has to understand. I was going out there milking goats and things like that. And it was just funny because it's like, well, you can't milk that one because it's not trustworthy. It doesn't trust you because it has this thing that happened when it was a kid and you need to know, or how he gained a cow's trust by saving its calf, and just all these tiny stories, and he would make saddles from scratch and then he would sell those. And I think at some point in the long past, there was a president that came through that wanted to go on some horse rides. So he took him through, as the canyon leader, it's like but he's really, I think all of the people in my family they're very like technology plus media. So my aunt helped digitize film trailer production in Los Angeles. She thought, wow, we could digitize this. Let's do it. And then it was a little bit difficult after that because then, it changed the texture of the industry. So, my parents put television on the air when I was a kid. They worked in broadcast engineering. So this was the late 80s, early 90s. And all of it was analog. And after a while, my mom got laid off and her job was automated. And my dad's job was to automate the analog TV stations. When it was analog, there was a lot less mistakes because people had a culture around their work. But it didn't scale the way the digital TV does. But if you look at digital TV, it's pretty much rubbish. It's full of terrible compression artifacts. And sometimes the signal doesn't even come through at all. And I guess we joke about that with like the rabbit ear antenna and but there's something that's lost. Like the soul is lost because it's not analog. And I don't say this because I'm being like arcane or something. It's that the mind reacts differently to non-abstract, non-digital objects. And if you are going to make something digital, it better have physical buttons so that your mind can get comfortable with it and feel familiar. And you certainly should have raised dots on buttons on the back of a TV so that you know which button is a power button without having to take your phone out, turn on the flashlight, go around the TV, unfold it from the wall, hope it doesn't fall on you, and then finally turn it off.
I did it last night.
Right? These are the tiny micro moments that keep you away from living life. And they seem really small, and we have to deal with them. And it's a mild dystopia, but it's not big enough that we do something about it. And so for me, it's let's collect those stupid tiny moments that are causing you annoyance, and let's try to make design methods and, reward companies with certification that do a better job, that follow these human guidelines. And it's not about ethics. It's about making something that is in line with what technology promised us, which was to give us more human time back. And I think most of us spend more time configuring our technology than we do using it.
I I heard you bring up two Greek terms that I hadn't heard in 20, 25 years. And as soon as I heard you say them, it hit me in the face. Like, oh, that's the explanation of what's wrong, but the idea of chronos and kairos. Can you explain those?
Sure. So Chronos time is a kind of industrial time. So you have a meeting from 8 a.m. to 9 a.m. Here's your agenda. And it's very good for reproducing something, right? So it's very much factory time. And then you have Kairos time, and Kairos time is like human felt time. So it's the time of what you remember on your deathbed. So holding a lover's hand for the first time, watching a sunset and not filming it with your camera. It's about a baby's first steps. It's about the things that matter and the things you regret not doing more of when you're in a doom scroll and you can't get out of it. It's that time that we were promised, Oh, you don't have to do any labor anymore. Tech will do it for you and you'll be free to do art. But the same people aren't learning art, and sometimes I joke about life extension is people want to extend their life because they haven't lived it yet. And it's why we work really hard and then we finally go to Italy and we taste real olive oil for the first time and we say, oh my gosh, that was a great 2 weeks. And we leave. We don't say, did you know that reality could be like that every day? It's like it's a tourism to the real, as if it's a Disneyland. Disneyland's supposed to be fake and the real world is supposed to be real. But when people visit a real world and say, oh, that was nice, it kind of flips it on its head. It's a very Baudrillard concept. But
I was going to bring that up in a little bit, including talking about, second selves and how we've also become addicted to living this alternative life online, and just how we've become disconnected from the real, and all of it seems like a trick that was played on us by capitalism, this idea that the Industrial Revolution was going to somehow make things easier and more efficient. And they tried to turn us into machines. And when that didn't quite work, they sold us on this idea that technology was going to make everything easier and that was going to free us. And somehow we're working more than we ever did before. I work more than my grandfather did in 1960. I don't understand that at all.
I was trying to find some of the earliest films ever made, and one film is about this guy who has a very old accent because he's 90 years old, and I think I forgot what year it is, but he's a farmer. And he's talking about the future and cars that have been invented, all sorts of things, and he was just like, I love my work and I love what I do. 90-year-old farmer having a great time. He's like, this is great. He said, I'm sorry for the next generations because all this automation doesn't actually give you the satisfaction. And there's this great book called The Human Use of Human Beings. And I think it's just this culture it's not that there's one central node. I never really use the word capitalism because I just don't use it. It's more the tendency for people to be rewarded by abstracting and consolidating labor. I didn't even want to use the word labor either, because I would say I don't necessarily have a political philosophy. It's more, as an anthropologist, I just look at what is. And the surface area that we have, I always use the word surface area, the available options we have on our video game controller for life right now are far less buttons than we've had before. And a lot of those buttons are distraction. To make something unique or new, it's not that it's any harder or easier than before. It's not like Brian Eno hanging out in a room wasn't hated by most people and misunderstood. It's just that we have this tendency to be shortcutty. Humans love shortcuts, and now we've really monetized shortcuts. And I feel like there's this law of conservation of shortcut, which anytime you shortcut, you still have to do all of the labor involved. It just gets moved to another space. So, you have a gym and there's an escalator and there's the stairs and everyone's taking the escalator to the gym. And cognitively, we take shortcuts. That's why we have stereotypes. That's why comedy works. It triggers the little shortcuts you have. Oh, that rhymes. That's similar. And it's really hard, someone who's a really good journalist can go into a space not having yet information about it and faithfully represent it. Same with documentary film. Journalism, you do that really quickly. It's really impressive. But now in a sense, I think it's always been the same. It's hard to do new things, especially if the norm is not that. You're going to get lambasted for it. It's not going to be fun. And then, after it becomes the norm or it gets realized or it gets popularized, then, oh, duh, that's totally the thing, that Windows sound, by Brian Eno, well, that's just part of the fabric of the 90s, and so I was just reading Chris Ware's journals. So Chris Ware is a comic artist that I love following, and it's just him being hard on himself for like 300 pages in the year 2000, just being absolutely rotten to himself, and then also being mean to other people around him because he's doing something that nobody is doing in the comics industry, and the comics industry is actively consolidating and reducing the joy of, its vibrant coral reef or whatever. And in a sense, it's always kind of been like that. You have a couple people like Mobius, the French Western extraordinaire watercolor psychedelic guy. He was amazing. And you have these offshoots, and you see him at 35 or something, being hard on himself. And of course, he turns into an incredibly important comic artist. But you watch him talk about himself in front of the easel, just being mean to himself. And I don't think that's any different from it is today, or the 1850s, the 1600s. And we talk about, the dark ages in which you could do even less, and you could only do craft if someone was commissioning you, it's just as much distraction in a sense, I think, until really far in the past where we had smaller groups. And those groups saw nature reproduce over time and said, okay, well, we can study that and have 1,000 years of memory and understand how to work with it so that we don't have to actually do that much because nature does most of the work. It's a great cybernetic feedback loop. So I think there was so much intelligence in that. Of course, nothing's perfect, but right now we're making systems that take so much to maintain that it makes it hard for everybody but a few people to live. And that is not an efficient, clever, or interesting system to me. A clever system is where it's easy to run by people. It doesn't mean that it's an iPad. It doesn't mean a 2-year-old can use it. It means that people understand how to maintain their sewing machine, that they actually can learn massive skills, and that when there's an issue, you have a bunch of people with hobbies and hobby free time that can make nice things for each other. And people who know enough about gardening or planting or anything like that, you can make a very small ecosystem. You can change an ecosystem into a cloud forest if you're clever enough. But nature's doing a lot of the work. So I think being reliant on these extremely expensive, convoluted systems, especially like our averaging LLM system that gets us really great medium averaging stuff. The fact that you need to be a very highly paid expert mathematician programmer to be able to make something for that means that it has pretty significant failure points. Whereas a car, you don't need a math degree to build a car. I mean, you can learn about an exhaust manifold and how to make it out of cast iron. You can be a blue-collar worker. And I don't even really like the notion of like blue-collar and white-collar, but I think of it as abstraction. Do you have experience with physical objects, or have you only rendered them in a CAD program? And I was one of the last generations I got to do drafting class, architecture class, engineering, mechanical engineering. We had 3D printers, we had CAD. I did all my drafting on paper. And then we went into the lab and got to digitize it. And I remember feeling depressed after we did just the digital. And I calculated the time that was different between having a really hands-on drafting teacher who taught me to think before I actually put it to paper and do sketches, so I could produce these really well thought through systems. Having the undo button in the digital actually slowed me down because I was making fast decisions, but they weren't the right ones. And so even though I could learn, AutoCAD, Autodesk Inventor, exploded assembly models, mechanical engineering, figuring out all the different materials very quickly, and it was a competitive class. It was, I wanted to be the top of the class, I didn't have the connection to the objects that drafter, who was very, very clever, did. And I felt like there was something lost. And now when you look at, a fast contractor build suburban house where everything falls apart and the sink has been installed incorrectly and the hot and the cold are out, all these little tiny errors, like you're living in a website. That makes me really sad because it's also not going to last that long, and that nice little ceiling brace that got invented that allows you to make McMansions means that you can have a lot of space, but it isn't quality space. And I think, a lot of the West is defined by that. Let's have more, but it doesn't mean as much.
The design aspect of it often frustrates me, and listening to you, it, I guess, affirms some of what I'm feeling. That you're describing designing something at the drafting stage. You have to be thoughtful and considered, and yet I will pick up a phone and think, this doesn't even remotely work like a phone should, and why my life is more difficult because I just spent a fortune on this phone instead of easier. And I think I had none of that stress when I just picked up the incredibly effective phone on the wall to do all of these things.
Yeah, and you had Bell Labs scientists coming up with research questions, which I think Claude Shannon answered one of them. Claude Shannon being, the father of the information age, I guess. And the question that was posed to him, as far as I know, was, why is there noise in this signal? And him going to figure it out changed how we do telephony. It was those kind of general research questions in a lab made by a monopolistic company, which sometimes works out really well. It's a huge company, and so you put it into a bunch of research to figure out the future, and we got really efficient signal processing. And we got phones that compressed perfectly or very well for human voice, which is why when you're put on hold and you hear some really bad orchestra, that's why it sounds terrible, because it's calibrated for human voice, not the ambient transient of a piano key when it hits the hammer to the string. That's huge. It's not what a phone is designed to process and compress. And so the Cisco hold music that somebody made, I think they were 17 years old, is now on 1 billion devices, and a bunch of people will call it up just to hear the hold music because it's so nice, because it's made for that compression of the phone. So these little stories, it's like history is peppered with these things that we don't really think about. I think designers and scientists answering general questions and playing around and doing what if. And then before, design was not how it looked, but how it worked. We had design leadership at the level of the C-suite in many companies because it was important. And more recently, design has been neutered. It's like reduced to some sort of quantitative, make this persona that's fake. User experience isn't, it's like, it's been defanged. You can't go to the CEO and say, this isn't how it should be. And now with most of the stuff getting automated, most of our interfaces will look the same. And in a sense, they might not even be the best interface. They might just look the same, but they aren't made for how our hands understand things, because they'll be really digital. And our hands have eyes too. The perceptual space of your fingertips is humongous. And that's why we can drive a car, use a foot pedal, put one hand on the steering wheel, turn the radio dial that has ridges so it's easy to find, easy to hold, and have a conversation at the same time as we're looking at the road with our peripheral attention, understanding who's in the lane behind us because we have a rear view mirror. The car is designed to go very fast, and we get all that information. We can handle simultaneous processing of all that information, and we don't call it multitasking in a car. We just call it focus. You have a whole conversation, even a fight still. Be fine in a car. But, the world is, the minute we take those buttons away, then we have to look at the screen in the car and we can't have the conversation. And it's the same with our automated checkout counters. If you're going to make an automated checkout system in a grocery store to offload the labor onto the customer and call it automation, you might as well give people the same power tools as the actual checkout clerks have. If you look at how the checkout clerks work, they don't use one of those crappy touchscreens that barely registers your finger. Also, if you have a dry climate like Denver, Colorado, where I live, touchscreens work less. So you just can't do that. But what you see with a clerk in a lot of stores is they have a physical button PLU system for entering the number for the produce, and you can watch their fingers go because it's a physical button, and there's a little raised dot in the middle on the 5 so that they can orient their fingers without looking at it and know exactly where they are to type in that number. And after a year or two of working there, they've memorized every number. It's not a big deal. It's like memorizing Pokemon, whatever. And it's kind of a skill. It's a flex. You can see how proud they are of being able to do this in flow. And anybody who's in the supermarket and automated checkout system doesn't even get those power tools. They're getting some sort of consumer dumbed down version. And it's the same at the level of like, why don't we have these systems that still work? Well, they're not contractor grade, you know?
This might be a good place to ask about the role of Hollywood in impacting, ruining design, convincing us of how things are supposed to work because maybe they look sexy on screen, but there isn't a practical application or a convenient application in our world. Does that ring true to you at all?
Yeah. So Hollywood is interesting because what is stimulating to the mind on a screen for an hour and a half is different than what you need in your house. So if you've got some sort of talking robot or bright blue lights, it looks really great because in sci-fi it's supposed to take your attention and be exciting. But you're not going to have a science fiction show about a boring washer and dryer that like have a nice tone when they're done. It doesn't happen. And I talked with someone who made most of the user interface designs that is used in Hollywood. And he said he wanted to make the interface different. Whenever you see a computer screen, a agency or a spy movie or whatever, it's all the same guy who makes them all. And he said he has one Adobe After Effects file, and he never gets paid enough to redesign and do a different direction because people just want to know what works. It's like the same Foley library that you use. I get really annoyed in movies because I'm like, that's the same cat sound from the 7,000 item library that you can license for $10K. David Lynch, an experimental filmmaker, would never do that. He would always record all of his own sounds. So everything he did was unique and interesting. But of course, you're not going to do that if you're not a huge sound nerd. You just need to get your movie out. It doesn't matter if the budget's $50 million. You're not going to make your own sound because everybody responds to that cat sound. Wow. There's one where there's like, you throw a cat in a different direction. It always sounds the same. It's those where I'm like, I heard those before. I heard that in that movie, But I think it's this thing about Hollywood is also when LEDs came out, light emitting diodes, and I used to go with my dad to Radio Shack where you would pick up all your electronics if you wanted to design circuit boards, and I would help him build circuit boards. It was always that the red and the yellow and the green LEDs, which are lower power, they take less power to run. They were always a couple cents. Super cheap to buy. But when the blue LED came out, it was $40 American. Sitting there saying, these are the same size and shape, but it's a slightly different color. Why is this so expensive? My dad was like, it's so much higher power. It's really expensive. And I said, well, what's going to happen? Like, when can we buy one? And he said, well, things have a way of getting cheaper over time. And when things get cheap, we're going to have red, green, and blue super shrunk down, and we'll be able to have these digital liquid crystal displays and OLED. The very first time I saw an OLED display, it was $3,000. And it was like the size of a Altoids tin. It was so small. But it was so engaging. The colors were so bright. And I looked at it and I thought, whoa. I couldn't imagine that everyone would have them in their pockets. The refresh rate on them is difficult. There's this thing called pulse width modulation or flicker. It can make people sick, can give people headaches. You're staring at this giant thing, super high energy. And so now it's cheap to have blue LEDs. One of the people who made it cheap got the Nobel Prize in physics. And it was in the past, as it is today. In the past, if you were commissioned to make a painting of the Virgin Mary, for instance, you would wait for the most expensive color to paint her at that time. And for a while, the most expensive color of pigment was blue. So you would have this Virgin Mary and you'd wait and you'd be on commission. And if the person didn't pay you, you couldn't really finish it. But you'd special order that blue at closest to the price you could and paint. And here you go, this incredible color. With light, I think it's been the same. It's the color of the future is blue because blue once was the most expensive color to produce. And now we're in a situation where blue looks like the future. And so we've overfit that in most of our films, but living alongside bright blue or staring at bright blue screens or dealing with flicker or having really crappy LED lights is really an issue for a couple of reasons. First, sometimes when you go into a dressing room and you just look terrible, like you look gray, a lot of those are really low quality lights. And low quality lights have this thing called a color rendering index. And it goes up to 100. 100 is the best. A good incandescent bulb will be 100. So you see all of the reds in someone's face. And you see like all the different color and texture. And if you're in a handbag store and there's a red bag, you're seeing this beautiful red bag, or you're in a high-end restaurant and sushi and you see all the colors, you feel like you're outside. It's like the color of the sun and it's so beautiful. And then you go out into the parking lot to try and find your car, and you can't see what car from another, and you can't find your car, and you say, well, I must be losing it. In general, the lights in those parking lots used to be 40 CRI, so really, really low on the color render index. There'd be these huge halogen things, so most of the cars in that spectrum would be folded into a lesser spectrum, so the reds would look like the yellows, would start, all of that different perception would go away. And we're not like a cat that can just see really well in the dark. So we lose things. And so a lot of the LEDs in our space are flickering. They're turning on and off really fast in order to provide dimming instead of constant circuit reduction dimming. So it's like smooth. And they're low CRI. So we actually don't have that delight of these older incandescent warm lights. And on our streets, we have LEDs because they're better for power, but it feels terrible. And then we have all these car lights at night that are super sharp. If you have any astigmatism in your eyes, you're seeing like 50 of them, and it's hard to drive. And they're piercing because they're tested on how well they render a car in front of you, not how horrible they are to drive in front of. So I think there's so many things that have changed just since 1995, not to mention when mobile phones are coming out and they're having full color screens, that now the main feature of the world is lit by poorly made artificial light, poorly compressed, bad interfaces that we can't touch without physical buttons, and automation that feels bad. And we could automate beautifully. We could build systems that work well, but we would need to have small family-run companies that don't need to be publicly traded to do it, because publicly traded companies always inshouldify. Cory Doctorow has that term, inshoudification. Because at some point, someone needs to get a payout because someone says, hey, you should really take this public. All of that hard work that you did over the last 20 years, founder, you can turn into money. Don't you want to have a yacht like your friends? Don't you want to hang out with Larry Ellison and your kid can take yacht lessons? It's not like I'm not making fun of them as if that's something that like people shouldn't want to do. It's just a norm in that social class that people would do it. And it wears people down after a while, and then they publicly trade, and they're like, that was a mistake. The number of companies whose founders I've talked to have said, that was a mistake. Now we can't provide the value that we want to our customers, and now we actually might not survive, and we're going to go through so many mergers and acquisitions, and it gets diluted. I think not everything needs to go into somebody's pension fund.
It's interesting because I'm listening to you describe how basically since the mid-90s, beauty was slowly erased from a lot of experiences because of this trend toward, I guess, maybe homogeneity, that the algorithm pushes everything toward a more uniform experience. You mentioned interfaces might all end up looking the same, but I was just reading about how coffee shops in obscure corners of the world now look like coffee shops in Brooklyn because Instagram. And so these moments of uniqueness that used to exist have to be surrendered maybe when they go public, and they get bought by another company just so that a small corner of their company can be absorbed and shipped back out in some universally accepted but ugly fashion.
I call it the shipping container for the soul, because the shipping container, when it was invented, was incredible. Now you could go from the back of a train to a truck to a giant container ship, and you knew what general sizes there were. You could invest in them, and they were interoperable across the entire world. And what you need to spray in those containers to make sure that rodents don't get into them, the formaldehyde, and then there's formaldehyde limits, and there's pallets, and there's treating those pallets with chemicals and sitting there, and how many you can stack in a harbor, and all that sort of thing. You know, it's just how you have to do it. But when we talk about the shipping container for the soul, it's like Alexander the Great's world oikumene, which, you know, his teacher Aristotle was talking about. If you can get everybody to be the same religion, it's much easier to have an empire because it's interoperable with everything else. You know, flow of goods is easy, whatever. So you have Zuckerberg studying this in school and basically making the new Alexander the Great empire, in which, as long as you reduce everyone to a template itself, they can interoperate in that shipping container for your soul, and you can interact. And Facebook was very smart to turn itself into some acquisitions if it couldn't reach the markets. Like, oh, we don't see people on Facebook anymore, so we're going to buy Instagram. Incredible purchase. I was one of the first Instagram users. I met the founders before they started Instagram. And it was an interesting situation. I mean, there's WhatsApp. Like, you know, it's communication. And we didn't communicate like this before. And now this is how we communicate. And my question is, you know, how much of this will be remembered? In 2015, there was an article that came out, I think it was Fujitsu, talked about a future digital dark age, in that people aren't taking the photos that they had out of their phone and saving them. People aren't writing a poem about something. They're handwriting less, and so they're less really there in the world. They're commuting to a world that's, you know, 500,000 objects deep, but like extremely shallow. And what does that mean? I think we will probably see the revenge of the real as people get hypersaturated, just like every time things get saturated, and then there will be some pushback in a new kind of culture. The problem is that even the pushback to any of these cultures has already been co-opted before it got out of the crib. So it's like, actually, the system is so effective at finding the edges, folding them into the middle, and putting ads on them, that unless you're doing something offline, it's really hard. Meanwhile, you know, you go on a road trip and you're like, oh yeah, this is the real world. This is nice. And you remember all the things that you wanted to do, and they're all right there for you.
Yes. The world of streaming is doing this to film and television, where once upon a time, and I might be telling you things that you know, France had a very specific aesthetic. They made television a specific way. They made films a specific way. South Korea did. And increasingly, I'll hear something out of London. Like, oh, if we don't change, we're not going to be able to compete with Hollywood. We're going to be forced to just become a production arm for Hollywood's interests. So they have to basically transform themselves into something that is acceptable for the streaming format, which means sand away those edges, do something that looks like what's being released from Australia and Brazil and Hollywood. And everything ends up with a uniform look, a vibe. And so you can watch something out of India and feel safe. That investment in the Indian product is safe because it'll translate to so many other countries. But that's how we got all the innovation in cinema. That's how we discovered what cinema was, because somebody saw Eisenstein and stole from him. And they fed off of each other. And now we're ending up with just increasingly generic shit that makes me want to go watch old movies.
Yeah, and when you're a kid, you're no longer running around backyard with your friends like Steven Spielberg making
Yes.
weird stuff. You are trying to make stuff for the algorithm. So I have a whole different identity that does film and had a record label and photography. And I noticed I came in with fairly original stuff, and then I started doing photography for brands within 3 years. And I was like, oh no, what am I doing? And meanwhile, a lot of my friends, they'll do like National Geographic shoots and stuff like that, and that's always about bringing the edges into the foreground, right? And so that you want to have the uniqueness, but then there's also that idea of what that looks like, right? So I think, if we want to talk a little bit about 2001: A Space Odyssey, I mean, I think it's that film. One of the reasons why I liked it is because all of it was done analog, and
Yes.
when you make it a huge cinema experience, every year they would show that in 70 millimeter, and I would go and I'd sit in the front row because I wanted to see the decals and all of the little user interface elements that they put, because they labeled and put text on every single thing, and it was accurate 100%, exactly what you would label those doors. Extreme exquisite detail. And all of Kubrick's films are like
Absolutely. Well, we'll get into that more in a moment, but maybe we should wrap up this part of the conversation. We've talked about a lot of negative aspects of technology. It's very easy to focus on the worst aspects of it because there's so many and it feels like everything's terrible. But I read about calm tech and I think, oh, I want to go buy this product you're talking about. That seems like something that would actually bring joy back to my life. Yes. So yes, what fills you with hope? How do we fix what comes next?
Yeah. Well, it's easy to criticize because it's easy to point out how bad things are. But what I'm doing with Calm Tech Institute is trying to show people that all the answers are already there and that most everything has been solved. Which is a weird thing to say, that like there are technology universals and human universals, and that tech actually doesn't need to be this thing that moves really quickly. Right now, tech is financialized, so it's a financial tool. It's not really, the surface area of the tech is about making new ways of making money and exploring how to make good returns for investors. But the real stuff, like I love this company Time Timer, because you can see across the room how much time is left. And it has a simple affordance, and you can be 3 years old and not know how to tell time yet. And it's like the squishy exterior, and you can take the exterior off, and you can change it out. And it has a little beef on the back that you turn on and off. And it uses a AA battery. I mean, it's hard to talk about these things because they're so good that they just become part of your life. It's like having a conference about not the future of the thermostat, or having a conference on the doorknob or the foot pedal or a sewing machine. Or it's like, yeah, these are pretty much solved. Like, you can have a doorknob in a lot of different materials and flavors and colors, but what about designing one that feels really good to use? Or the idea that like the key gets stuck a little bit and it's kind of hard to get in. But man, if someone tried to get into your house, it would be kind of hard. And you would hear them rattling the key in the doorknob, and you'd say, well, they don't know me. Like, it's like the little things. It's like a hardwood floor, and you know that part is the creak on the floor, so you don't walk over that part because you don't want to wake your parents up. It's these little tiny, it's those incongruencies, it's those little messy things that are delightful. And so when you start to put some of those things into physical products, like subtle texture, it helps you feel alive and connect. And for me, I call it relaxation as time travel. You go back and use an object from the past, and suddenly everything's just really nice. So I really want to, venerate? I really want to venerate products that have been done well to show people, especially who don't know that things could be good, that we deserve better and we can make stuff a lot better. And I do think in the 90s, it's funny that everybody's so nostalgic for the 90s right now, but I think it's warranted, Even something like this is a lacy hard drive. It's got this squishy material on it. It's a really boring hard drive, right? It's that terrible space gray that we were told is the future and that we should have our entire lives with. but now it has the squishy cover, and of course I'm going to draw all over it because I like it, right? So just, the little subtle texture and spaces, like you even have this little board here that's showing my schedule. It's empty right now, but and wood and e-ink. So it's not drawing my attention unless I want it to. I have these picture frames by Aura, and they just show nice pictures in the environment. It's the thing is, it's really hard to market it because it's just like you go into a room and your shoulders drop and you say, why is it so nice in here? And how that stimulates the brain is really interesting. I joined the science advisory board at Remarkable, which is a tablet company that has an e-ink display, and it's like tools for thinking. And I started meeting with these neuroscientists about what happens to your mind when you go on a walk and you see fractals, nature and text. Texture, not text. And what happens when you see a social media post, and how does your mind operate differently? What's stimulated? And it's so obvious the differences. So, if tech can feel more like nature, and that in the Victorian times we brought so much decoration into our wooden displays and carvings and wallpaper. We had this love of nature through the entirety of human history. Now, that didn't mean that, we preserved nature. It meant that we loved flowers. Even the super industrialists in England, I'm automating everyone with machines. What was on their walls? Gorgeous images of beautiful vines and plants. All of their silverware had tiny little descriptions of nature. They were wearing beautiful clothes of all the finest colors. I mean, so it's really funny to be like, the industrialists don't like nature, but somehow we got into this notion post-World War II, I think partially because of the New York aesthetic, where several trust fund kids had their parents buy them some empty shell, and that's where we got like the empty minimalist warehouse district type thing so they could make art, and then, oh, that's cool. Industrial, not romantic industrial, just industrial. We're going to repurpose these environments that once were used for meat packaging and slaughterhouse for something that we can make an equally huge mess with oil paints. And then we're going to convert them into luxury condos to people that don't do art at all. And it wasn't, and you work for a hedge fund. I've been to a bunch of these converts, having lived in New York. And it's not to say that, oh, it's bad or good or whatever, but it's each thing seeking authenticity. First, the artist is in the authenticity of the place that was a spot of creativity, even if that's sledgehammering a cow. And then the second one was, I want to be in a place that has a story, but by the time all those walls have been redone with some plaster, there's no textured surface left, and you're in an echoing, hostile room that's hostile to the human soul. The only thing you have left is to... Yeah. So we can bring nature back into spaces with texture and buttons, like raised surfaces and beautiful things. Like, you don't have to have a TV that looks like a TV. It could look like a beautiful frame. You could have an air filter system that kind of looks like it's behind a beautiful wrought iron grate from the Victorian times. And I think James Turrell, the artist that works with light, has done an incredible job on blending the modern and the old, because he made this house of light in Niigata, Japan. It's a fully automated house, but all of it is behind these little control panels. So you open up this beautiful wall of paper or this beautiful bamboo, and behind is your control system. And because it's behind the control system wall, the wood and the texture and the paper, it's just like a beautiful rice paper, which can last for 500 years apparently. It's an acoustic abatement system, so it's super modern, because I forgot who said it, but a good design is not afraid of age or time, because time does nothing to it. So we can make stuff that's timeless again. The calendar picker on your device can just be one that's good that everybody's used to, and we can have neat things. I was telling this to a giant Indian automation firm. They had me give a keynote, and I said, how many of you have considered making a website that looks like your culture? And I asked that because I said, I've been hanging out in southern India, gone to college in an international dorm, hung out with all these people from India. And a lot of my investors of my latest startup were from India, and I've participated in a lot of culture, and it's so vibrant and beautiful and like, full of life and spice. And then you look at the websites you guys are making, and they just look like Microsoft. So what's a website that would look like you? Your culture, your soul. Have you ever considered making it? And the term for that is cosmotechnics. Every culture has their own technology. And in Japan, Japanese websites are crazy. They're super complex, blah, and in your face, and you have that in Tokyo, and then you have Kyoto, which has like 1,000 years of history at least, keeping the same tradition in a family for 800 years. So it's this crazy thing of one never had to see time, and the other one is constant shifting. And I think time is about reproducibility. If you constantly are unhappy with what you're doing and improving, are you really improving, or are you just standing in place? Whereas something that has some sort of tradition and isn't abstract can be really beautiful. And that's not to say that everyone should stop and be a soy sauce farmer. I think that job is like really arduous. You need to learn the meditative skill of being able to stir that in a vat for 10 hours a day. But, there's a lot to be learned from people that have already done stuff well. And if we have to buy too many things, none of those things have any value and meaning anymore because we can't develop a relationship with them. But with old stuff, like your 100-year-old chair that you're sitting in, you have a relationship with that chair, and it helps you feel real in your flat, empty wall behind you.
Yes.
Because time calms people down. The presence of any old object in a room is going to help people relax. And so if you put subtle texture from nature on an object that you're touching, even if it's something like a dehumidifier, you're going to feel calmer when you use that piece of technology instead of like you're touching an alien spaceship. And that's all you need to do. I mean, physical buttons, subtle texture, real materials, visual harmony, rounded edges, ergonomics. I mean, you can improve the experience of the world deeply with just those things. And by consolidating them into touchscreens, I think we went a little bit too far. It's just like, let's go back just a little bit. And yeah, I mean, it's about hopefully a new generation of people realizing that you could do it well, and then having guidelines to do it well, and having them be very clear. And then having people develop an intuition, like a sommelier understands wine. We're not having a sommelier bot come to your table and have a suggestion for wine, because if you're rich enough, you do not have abstraction. You have your foot measured in Italy, and you have custom leather shoes fit to your foot, just like Princess Di. So there's an incentive to consolidate and abstract as much as possible, but I think the cognitive deleterious effects are really big that we have to make up for. So it's more like, hey, understand that everybody's quite capable of many, many things because we're humans, and work with that instead of trying to make us the lowest common denominator. Or if we are going to be factory preachers, then we might as well have a nice factory environment while we do our automated work for the system. Because in the past we were, but there was just a little bit more there. Like you could work in a factory for 50 years, and you could have your train in your basement and your hobbies. That's not to say that everything was great, right? But I think the future is some mix of that. And we can definitely retooth the designer to be able to push back a little bit. Because as we make everything mediocre, the demand for something else will happen. And that's just what the human mind does. If things get too tedious, it's like it gets boring. So we'll see what happens. Otherwise, we're in a Wall-E world.
Thank you. I'm incredibly glad I had you on. You've given me so much to think about and explained without perhaps realizing it so much of my frustration with media at the moment. So conversation for another day. We'll come back in a moment to talk about 2001. But until then, thank you so much. As for you out there listening today, thanks for stopping by for some 5 a.m. Story Talk. Don't just run yet. There's a bonus episode with Amber Case to come, which I'll tell you more about in just a moment. First, what did you make of this conversation with Amber? It certainly shook me at points. It also left me furious at how ugly our world has become, how disposable everything our lives now are. If you have any questions or thoughts about this discussion, drop them in the comments on this episode's posts at the 5 a.m. Story Talk newsletter at Substack or the 5 a.m. Story Talk podcast at Instagram. You can find links to both in the show notes, along with great links about Amber's work and the Calm Tech Institute. I'm also going to include a link to one product in particular, the remarkable Paper Pro, which is a tablet that simulates a paper experience. It looks amazing. Maybe they'll send me one for mentioning it. Now, as for that bonus episode, Amber returns to discuss a foundational artwork from her life, the film 2001, A Space Odyssey from 1968. If you found anything Amber said here mind-expanding, provoking in the most exciting way, or just interesting, you can count on more of this from the bonus ep, as we're going to lean hard into design in 2001, what we've lost and how we experience a film like it, and, similar. There's a wonderful nostalgic wistfulness to the second part of our conversation too, which I really appreciated. The best way to listen to this podcast ep is at Apple or the 5 a.m. Story Talk newsletter at Substack. Links in the show notes too. Upcoming guests of this podcast include musician Ben Lee, Schmigadoon creator and showrunner Cinco Paul, and my dear friend Erin Cahill, who's an actress who starred in a bunch of fun Hallmark Christmas films. We're going to try to work out together what these holiday films mean to our culture. Every one of my guests have something to say about our world and the stories we tell, so be sure to subscribe if you don't want to miss out. Thanks again for being part of this conversation, Story Talkers. See you soon.